The letter arrived on a Tuesday, its crisp white envelope a stark contrast to the usual bills and junk mail cluttering my mailbox. I recognized the return address immediately: Blackthorn, Weaver, and Associates, attorneys at law. My heart skipped a beat. This had to be about Uncle Edgar's estate. I tore open the envelope with trembling fingers, my eyes scanning the formal language until I found what I was looking for. Hereby bequeathed to my nephew, James Holloway, the entirety of my estate, including the property known as Ravenscroft Manor. The words swam before my eyes. Uncle Edgar had left me everything? I barely knew the man. He'd been the black sheep of the family, living in seclusion for as long as I could remember. The few times I'd met him as a child, he'd seemed stern and forbidding, his eyes cold and distant. But now, apparently, I owned his house, Ravenscroft Manor. The name alone sent a chill down my spine, though I couldn't say why. The letter went on to explain that I needed to visit the property within the month to claim my inheritance. If I failed to do so, everything would be donated to charity. It seemed simple enough, but something about the whole situation felt off. I called my boss and requested a week off work. He wasn't happy about it, but I promised to make up the time when I returned. Then I packed a bag, loaded up my old Honda Civic, and set off for the small town of Millbrook, where Ravenscroft Manor awaited. The drive took most of the day. As I left the city behind, the landscape grew wilder, the roads narrower and more winding. By the time I reached Millbrook, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. I stopped at a small diner on the outskirts of town, hoping to grab a quick meal before heading to the manor. As I slid into a booth, I noticed the other patrons giving me curious looks. Small town, I thought. They probably don't get many outsiders. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and kind eyes, approached with a menu. "What brings you to Millbrook?" she asked, her voice friendly but tinged with something I couldn't quite place. Caution, maybe. I inherited a property here, Ravenscroft Manor, I said, suddenly feeling uncomfortable under her scrutiny. The clatter of a dropped plate cut me off. The waitress's face had gone pale, her eyes wide with what could only be described as fear. "Ravenscroft," she whispered. "Oh, honey, you don't want to go there. That place, it ain't right." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" She glanced around nervously, then leaned in close. "Listen to me. Whatever you do, don't stay there after dark. And if you hear singing, run. Run and don't look back." Before I could ask any more questions, she straightened up and plastered on a fake smile. "Now, what can I get you to eat?" I ordered a burger, my appetite suddenly diminished. As I waited for my food, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The other diners kept stealing glances at me, their expressions a mix of pity and fear. What had I gotten myself into? By the time I finished my meal, night had fallen completely. I paid my bill and headed back to my car, the waitress's warning echoing in my mind. Part of me wanted to find a motel and wait until morning to visit Ravenscroft, but something compelled me forward. It was my property now, after all. What was there to be afraid of? As I drove through the darkened streets of Millbrook, following the GPS on my phone, the houses grew fewer and farther between. Soon, I was on a narrow road winding through dense forest. The trees loomed on either side, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. And then, suddenly, I saw it. Ravenscroft Manor. It rose out of the darkness like a monster from the depths, a sprawling Victorian mansion that seemed to devour the night around it. Turrets and gables jutted at odd angles, and the windows, God, the windows. They were like eyes, staring down at me as I pulled up to the wrought iron gates. I got out of the car, my legs shaky beneath me. The gate was padlocked, but the attorneys had sent a key along with the letter. It took me 3 tries to get it into the lock. My hands were trembling so badly. As the gate swung open with a rusty groan, a gust of wind swept past me, carrying with it the scent of decay and something else, something sickly sweet that made my stomach churn. I drove up the overgrown driveway, gravel crunching beneath my tires. As I parked in front of the house, I could have sworn I saw movement in one of the upper windows. But when I looked again, there was nothing but darkness. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed my bag and approached the front door. The key the lawyers had provided slid into the lock smoothly, as if the house was eager to let me in. The door swung open, revealing a cavernous entrance hall. The air inside was stale and musty, thick with dust and the weight of forgotten memories. I stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind me with a thunderous boom. I was in Ravenscroft Manor, and I was no longer alone. The sound of the door slamming shut echoed through the vast entrance hall, making me jump. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the space around me. Dust motes danced in the beam, and the light cast eerie shadows on the faded wallpaper. To my right, a grand staircase swept upwards, its wooden banister worn smooth by countless hands. To my left, an archway led to what appeared to be a sitting room. Directly ahead, a long hallway stretched into darkness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and fragile in the oppressive silence. No response came, but I could have sworn I heard a faint rustling, like fabric brushing against fabric, coming from somewhere upstairs. I shook my head, trying to dispel the growing sense of unease. It was just an old house settling, nothing more. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My first order of business was to find the fuse box and get some lights on. I made my way down the hallway, my phone's beam revealing closed doors on either side. At the end of the hall, I found a door that led to a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. After some searching, I located the fuse box in a small pantry off the kitchen. To my relief, when I flipped the main switch, lights flickered to life throughout the house. The sudden illumination made me feel a bit better, but it also threw the house's state of neglect into sharp relief. Layers of dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung in corners and from light fixtures. The air was thick with the musty smell of abandonment, tinged with that same sickly sweet odor I'd noticed outside. I made my way back to the entrance hall, intending to bring in my suitcase from the car. But as I reached for the door handle, a chill ran down my spine. The handle wouldn't turn. I tried again, putting my full weight into it, but the door remained stubbornly shut. Panic began to rise in my chest. I was locked in. "Calm down," I muttered to myself. "There has to be another way out." I turned back to face the house, my eyes darting from the staircase to the sitting room to the long hallway. Where should I go first? Before I could decide, a sound drifted down from upstairs. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew clearer with each passing second. Singing. A woman's voice, high and clear, singing a melody I didn't recognize. The words were in a language I couldn't understand, but there was something haunting about the tune, something that made my skin crawl. The waitress's warning flashed through my mind. "If you hear singing, run." But where could I run? The front door was locked, and I had no idea if there were other exits. Besides, a part of me, a part one wasn't proud of, was curious. Who was singing? Was there someone else in the house? Against my better judgment, I found myself moving towards the staircase. As I ascended, the singing grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from somewhere on the second floor. At the top of the stairs, I hesitated. To my left and right, hallways stretched into darkness, lined with closed doors. The singing was coming from the right, so that's the way I went, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried doorknobs as I passed, but each one was locked. The singing grew louder with each step, until I reached the last door on the right. This one, unlike the others, swung open at my touch. The room beyond was a bedroom, illuminated by moonlight streaming through a large bay window. In the center of the room stood a four-poster bed, its curtains drawn, and there, sitting on the edge of the bed, was a woman. She was facing away from me, her long, dark hair cascading down her back. She wore a white nightgown that seemed to glow in the moonlight, and she was singing. I stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move, unable to speak. The woman's song filled the air, filled my head, until it was all I could hear. Slowly, so slowly, she began to turn towards me. I caught a glimpse of pale skin, of lips curved in a smile that was somehow both beautiful and terrifying. And then, just as her eyes were about to meet mine, the lights went out. In the sudden darkness, the singing stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from right in front of me, came a whisper. "Welcome home, James." I screamed. I don't remember running back to my room. One moment I was in the doorway of that haunted bedroom, and the next I was slamming the door of what I decided would be my sleeping quarters, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I fumbled for the lock, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manage it. When I finally heard the click of the bolts sliding home, I sagged against the door, sliding down until I was sitting on the floor. What had I just seen? My mind reeled, trying to make sense of it. A ghost? A hallucination? Or was I simply going mad? I sat there for what felt like hours, listening intently for any sound from the hallway. But the house remained silent, as if nothing had happened. Eventually, exhaustion began to overtake fear. I climbed onto the bed, not bothering to undress or get under the covers. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of singing women and endless, dark hallways. I awoke to sunlight streaming through the windows. For a moment, I forgot where I was, and then the events of the previous night came rushing back. In the light of day, it all seemed absurd. Surely I had imagined it, or dreamed it. Still, I approached the bedroom door with caution. I pressed my ear against it, listening for any sound from the hallway. Hearing nothing, I slowly turned the lock and opened the door a crack. The hallway was empty and silent. Sunlight filtered through dusty windows, illuminating motes that danced in the air. There was no sign of the singing woman, no evidence that anything out of the ordinary had occurred. Feeling slightly foolish, but still on edge, I made my way downstairs. The entrance hall looked different in the daylight, less imposing, but no less neglected. I tried the front door again, but it remained stubbornly locked. My stomach growled, reminding me that I hadn't eaten since the diner the night before. I made my way to the kitchen, hoping to find something edible. To my surprise, the refrigerator was running and stocked with fresh food. Had Uncle Edgar's lawyers arranged for this? As I made myself a sandwich, I pondered my next move. I needed to find a way out of the house, but I also felt compelled to explore. This was my inheritance, after all. I needed to understand what I had gotten myself into. After eating, I decided to start my exploration in the sitting room off the entrance hall. It was a large, circular room dominated by a massive fireplace. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with ancient-looking tomes. A thick layer of dust covered everything, but beneath it, I could see that the furniture was of high quality. As I moved around the room, something caught my eye. On a small table near one of the windows sat a large, leather-bound book. Unlike everything else in the room, it was free of dust. I approached it cautiously, half expecting it to spring to life or burst into flames. But it remained inert, waiting. I picked it up, feeling the weight of it in my hands. Embossed on the cover in fading gold letters were the words, "Holloway Family Album." My curiosity piqued. I opened the album. The first page contained a family tree, tracing the Holloway line back several generations. I saw my father's name, and next to it, Uncle Edgar's. But there was something odd about Uncle Edgar's entry. Unlike the others, which showed birth and death dates, his simply had a question mark where the death date should be. I flipped through the pages, looking at photographs of stern-faced men and women in old-fashioned clothing. As I neared the end of the album, I froze. There, staring up at me from a sepia-toned photograph, was the woman I had seen the night before. She wore the same white nightgown, her long dark hair flowing around her shoulders. The caption beneath the photo read, "Elisabeth Holloway, 1887. My hands began to shake. This was impossible. The woman I had seen couldn't be the same as this woman from over a century ago. And yet, the resemblance was uncanny. As I stared at the photograph, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, I heard it again. Singing. It was coming from upstairs, the same haunting melody I had heard the night before. But this time, it was accompanied by something else. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the floor above me. I slammed the album shut and backed away from it, my heart racing. The singing grew louder, and the footsteps began to descend the stairs. Panic overtook me. I ran from the sitting room, down the hallway, looking for any way out. At the end of the hall, I found a door I hadn't noticed before. It was unlocked. I yanked it open and found myself facing a set of stairs leading down into darkness. Without hesitation, I plunged into the blackness, pulling the door shut behind me. The singing stopped abruptly, cut off by the closing door. I stood on the stairs, breathing heavily, straining my ears for any sound of pursuit. But there was only silence. I took out my phone, using its light to illuminate my surroundings. I was at the top of a steep staircase that led down into what appeared to be a basement. With nowhere else to go, I began to descend, each step taking me further into the bowels of Ravenscroft Manor. The stairs creaked ominously under my feet as I made my way down into the darkness. The beam from my phone's flashlight seemed pitifully inadequate, barely penetrating the thick gloom that surrounded me. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, the smell hit me, a damp, earthy odor mixed with something metallic that made my stomach churn. I swept my light around, revealing a large, open space filled with shadowy shapes I couldn't quite make out. I took a few tentative steps forward, my free hand outstretched to avoid bumping into anything. My fingers brushed against something cold and smooth, a light switch. I flipped it, holding my breath. With a series of loud clicks, overhead lights flickered to life, illuminating the basement in harsh fluorescent light. I blinked, my eyes adjusting to the sudden brightness. What I saw made me wish I had stayed in the dark. The basement was a laboratory of sorts, but like nothing I'd ever seen before. Long tables lined the walls, covered in an assortment of scientific equipment. Beakers, Bunsen burners, microscopes, all of it coated in a thin layer of dust. But it was what hung on the walls that made my blood run cold. Jars, dozens of them, of various sizes, each containing something. I approached one of the shelves, morbid curiosity overriding my fear. Inside the nearest jar, floating in some kind of preservative fluid, was what looked like a human hand, its fingers elongated and twisted into impossible shapes. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. What kind of sick experiments had Uncle Edgar been conducting down here? As I turned, ready to flee back up the stairs, something on the far side of the room caught my eye. It was a large, vertical tank, filled with a cloudy liquid, and inside, I approached slowly, dread building with each step. As I got closer, I could make out a human shape suspended in the fluid. It was a woman, her long dark hair floating around her like a halo. Her eyes were closed, her expression peaceful, as if she were merely sleeping. With a jolt of recognition, I realized it was the same woman from the photograph in the family album, Elisabeth Holloway. But how was this possible? The photograph was from 1887, and yet here she was, perfectly preserved, looking no older than she had in the image. As I stood there, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, I noticed something else. On a small table, next to the tank was a leather-bound journal. I picked it up with trembling hands and opened it. The journal was filled with Uncle Edgar's cramped handwriting, detailing years of research and experiments. As I skimmed through the pages, certain phrases jumped out at me. The key to immortality, reanimation of dead tissue. Elisabeth, my love, I will bring you back. With growing horror, I realized what Uncle Edgar had been trying to do. He had been attempting to resurrect Elisabeth, to bring her back from the dead. But why? Who was she to him? I flipped to the last entry, dated just a few weeks before Uncle Edgar's death. The handwriting here was shaky, almost frantic. It worked. God help me, it worked. But she's not the same. The thing that came back, it's not my Elisabeth. What have I done? A chill ran down my spine as I remembered the singing woman from upstairs. Had Uncle Edgar actually succeeded in bringing Elisabeth back to life? Was that who or what I had encountered? Before I could ponder this further, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze. Footsteps coming down the basement stairs. I looked around frantically for a place to hide, but the basement was open, with nowhere to conceal myself. The footsteps grew closer, slow and deliberate, and then I heard it. The singing, that same haunting melody, growing louder with each passing second. I backed up against the tank containing Elisabeth's body, my eyes fixed on the staircase. The singing grew louder, filling the basement, filling my head, and then she appeared. The woman from upstairs, Elisabeth Holloway, stood at the bottom of the stairs. She wore the same white nightgown, her dark hair flowing around her, But her face was wrong. Her skin was too pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were completely black, like empty sockets. She smiled at me, revealing teeth that were sharp and pointed. "James," she said, her voice a mixture of the beautiful singing and something altogether more sinister. "I've been waiting so long for you." She took a step towards me, and I realized with horror that her feet weren't touching the ground. She was floating, gliding towards me with unnatural grace. "Your uncle couldn't finish what he started," she continued. "But you have his blood. You can complete the ritual." I pressed myself against the tank, trying to put as much distance between myself and this horrifying apparition as possible. "What ritual?" I managed to croak out. Her smile widened, impossibly wide. "The ritual to bring me fully back, of course. To make me flesh and blood again." She reached out a hand towards me. "All it requires is a sacrifice. Your sacrifice, James." As her cold fingers brushed against my cheek, I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I don't remember how I made it past her. One moment I was pressed against the tank, paralyzed with fear, and the next I was halfway up the stairs, taking them two at a time. Elisabeth's inhuman shriek of rage followed me, spurring me on. I burst through the basement door and into the hallway, not daring to look back. The front door was still locked, so I ran up the main staircase, my footsteps thundering on the old wood. At the top of the stairs, I hesitated for a split second, unsure where to go. Then I spotted it, a small door at the end of the hallway that I hadn't noticed before. It was slightly ajar, and I could see the bottom of another staircase beyond it. Without thinking, I sprinted towards it. As I reached the door, I heard Elisabeth's voice from downstairs, her song now a furious, discordant wail. I slammed the door shut behind me and fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manage it. Finally, I heard the click of the bolt sliding home. I sagged against the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The staircase in front of me led up into darkness. The attic, I realized. For a moment, I stood there, listening. The house had gone quiet again. Had Elisabeth given up? Or was she waiting for me to come back down? Deciding I didn't want to find out, I began to climb the attic stairs. They were narrow and steep, creaking ominously under my weight. At the top, I found another door. This one opened easily, revealing the attic beyond. Dust motes danced in shafts of light that filtered through small, grimy windows. The space was cluttered with old furniture, trunks, and boxes, the accumulated detritus of generations of Holloways. I moved further into the attic, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. As I did, I began to notice something odd. The dust that covered everything else seemed to form a path through the clutter, as if someone had recently walked through here. Curiosity overrode my fear, and I found myself following the path. It led me to the far end of the attic, where a large, ornate mirror stood propped against the wall. Unlike everything else up here, the mirror was free of dust, its surface gleaming in the weak light. As I approached it, I felt a strange sensation, as if the air around the mirror was vibrating. And then I heard it whispering, faint at first, but growing louder as I drew closer. I couldn't make out the words, but there was an urgency to the sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I stood in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection, but as I watched, the image began to change. The me in the mirror looked older, gaunt, with dark circles under my eyes and a haunted expression. And behind me, I spun around, my heart racing, but there was nothing there. When I looked back at the mirror, my reflection was normal again. What was happening to me? Was I losing my mind? As if in answer to my unspoken question, words began to appear on the mirror's surface, as if written by an invisible hand. The key is in the blood. Break the cycle. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. What did it mean? What key? What cycle? Before I could ponder this further, I heard a noise from downstairs. A creak, like someone climbing the stairs to the attic. Panic seized me again. I looked around frantically for a place to hide. In the corner, I spotted a large trunk that looked big enough to fit me. I rushed over to it, threw open the lid, and climbed inside. Pulling the lid closed over me, In the darkness of the truck, I tried to control my breathing, straining my ears for any sound. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then I heard it. Footsteps in the attic, slow and deliberate. They moved around the space, coming closer to my hiding spot, then moving away again. And then, right next to the trunk, I heard Elisabeth's voice. "I know you're here, James," she said, her tone almost conversational. "I can smell your fear. You can't hide from me forever." I held my breath, praying she wouldn't think to look in the truck. "Your uncle thought he could control me," she continued. "He thought his science could tame death itself. But death isn't meant to be tamed, James. It's meant to be embraced." Her footsteps moved away, and I heard her sigh. "I'll give you some time to think about your options. But remember, the longer you resist, the hungrier I become. And when I'm hungry, well, let's just say it won't be pleasant for you." I heard her footsteps retreat, followed by the sound of the attic door closing. Even then, I didn't dare move, afraid it might be a trick. I don't know how long I stayed in that truck, my mind racing, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The mirror's message kept repeating in my head. The key is in the blood. Break the cycle. What did it mean? And more importantly, how was I going to get out of this nightmare? As I lay there in the darkness, I realized that finding a way out of Ravenscroft Manor wasn't enough. Something was very wrong here, and somehow I was connected to it. If I left now, would Elisabeth come after me? Would she go after others? No, I decided. I had to find a way to end this, once and for all. With newfound determination, I slowly opened the trunk lid and peered out. The attic was empty and silent. I climbed out, my joints stiff from being cramped in the trunk for so long. I made my way back to the mirror, half expecting to see more writing appear. But it remained blank, reflecting only my tired, scared face. "The key is in the blood," I murmured to myself. "Break the cycle." As I stared at my reflection, a thought began to form. Uncle Edgar had been trying to bring Elisabeth back to life. He'd written about a ritual in his journal. What if the ritual wasn't finished? What if that's why Elisabeth was trapped between life and death? And if the ritual wasn't finished, maybe it could be undone. With a sense of purpose, I turned away from the mirror and headed for the attic door. I needed to get back to the basement, to Uncle Edgar's journal. The answers I needed had to be there. As I reached for the door handle, I hesitated. Elisabeth was still out there, waiting for me, but I couldn't hide forever. It was time to face whatever Ravenscroft Manor had in store for me. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, ready to confront the horrors that awaited me. The house was unnaturally quiet as I made my way back downstairs. Every creak of the floorboards under my feet sounded like a gunshot in the silence. I kept expecting Elisabeth to appear around every corner, but the hallways remained empty. When I reached the main floor, I paused, listening intently. Nothing. No singing, no footsteps. Where was she? Pushing aside my unease, I made my way to the basement door. It was still unlocked, swinging open at my touch. The fluorescent lights were still on, casting their harsh glow over Uncle Edgar's macabre laboratory. I approached the tank where Elisabeth's body floated, suppressing a shudder. In the tank's glass, I caught a glimpse of movement behind me and spun around, my heart racing. But there was nothing there, just shadows playing tricks on my overwrought mind. Turning back to the task at hand, I picked up Uncle Edgar's journal from the table where I'd left it. I began to flip through it frantically, searching for any mention of the ritual that had brought Elisabeth back. As I neared the end of the journal, I found what I was looking for. Uncle Edgar had transcribed the ritual in painstaking detail. It involved a complex series of incantations and blood. Lots of blood. According to the journal, the ritual required the blood of a Holloway, freely given, to bind the resurrected soul to the living world. Uncle Edgar had used his own blood, but he died before the ritual could be completed. That's why Elisabeth was trapped in her current state, not fully alive, but not truly dead either. My eyes widened as I read the final step of the ritual. To complete the resurrection, Elisabeth needed to consume the heart of another Holloway. That's why she wanted me. I was the last of the Holloway line, but there was something else. Scrawled in the margin of the page, in handwriting that looked different from Uncle Edgar's usual script, were a few hastily written words. To undo, reverse the chant, return the blood. My mind raced. Could it really be that simple? Reverse the chant and what? Give Elisabeth back the blood that had been used in the ritual? I flicked back through the journal, looking for any more information on how to reverse the process. But there was nothing else, just those cryptic words in the margin. As I stood there, trying to make sense of it all, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Singing, coming from upstairs. Elisabeth was on the move. I had to act fast. I memorized the incantation from the journal, my lips moving silently as I committed each foreign word to memory. Then, taking a deep breath, I approached the tank where Elisabeth's body floated. The singing was getting louder. She was coming down the stairs. With shaking hands, I found the release valve on the side of the tank. As I turned it, the cloudy liquid began to drain away, leaving Elisabeth's body slumped at the bottom of the glass enclosure. The basement door burst open. There stood Elisabeth, her eyes black as night, her mouth open in a terrible smile that revealed rows of sharp teeth. "Oh, James," she said, her voice a mixture of song and hiss. "I'm so glad you've decided to join me. Are you ready to complete our little ritual?" I stood my ground, though every instinct screamed at me to run. "I know what you are," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, "and I know how to send you back." Her smile faltered for a moment, then returned, wider than ever. "You can try," she said, gliding towards me, "but you don't have the power. You don't have the blood." As she neared, I began to recite the incantation I'd memorized, but backwards. The foreign words felt strange on my tongue, but I pushed on, watching Elisabeth's face for any reaction. At first, nothing seemed to happen. Elisabeth's smile grew wider, more mocking. But then, as I neared the end of the reversed chant, her expression changed. Fear flickered in her black eyes. "No," she whispered. "No, you can't." She lunged at me, her hands outstretched, fingers curved like claws. But as she reached me, something extraordinary happened. Her form began to waver, like a mirage in the desert heat. I finished the chant, the final syllable echoing in the basement. Elisabeth screamed, a sound of pure anguish that shook the very foundations of the house. Her body began to dissolve, turning to mist before my eyes. The mist swirled around me, and I felt a deep, bone-chilling cold. Then, drawn as if by some unseen force, the mist flowed towards the tank where Elisabeth's body lay. I watched in amazement as the mist seeped into the body's skin, disappearing completely. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Elisabeth's eyes snapped open, and she gasped, a deep, rattling breath that seemed to go on forever. Her eyes, now a normal human brown, focused on me. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice weak but human. "Thank you for freeing me." And then, before my eyes, her body began to age rapidly. Decades passed in seconds as her skin wrinkled. Her hair turned white, and her body withered. In less than a minute, all that remained in the tank was a pile of dust and bones. I stood there, stunned, trying to process what had just happened. Had I really done it? Had I broken the cycle? As the adrenaline began to wear off, exhaustion hit me like a tidal wave. I sank to the floor, my back against the tank, and closed my eyes. Just for a moment, I told myself, just need to rest for a moment. I awoke with a start, disoriented and stiff. Sunlight was streaming through the small basement windows, and for a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or how I'd gotten there. Then it all came rushing back. Elisabeth, the ritual, the reversal. I scrambled to my feet, wincing at the protest from my cramped muscles. The tank behind me was empty now, not even dust remaining. Had it all been a dream? But no, there was Uncle Edgar's journal on the floor where I dropped it, and the rest of the basement was still filled with his bizarre experiments and specimens. I made my way upstairs on shaky legs, half expecting to hear Elisabeth's singing at any moment. But the house was silent, peaceful even. When I reached the entrance hall, I noticed something different. The front door, which had been stubbornly locked before, now stood slightly ajar. I approached it cautiously, then pushed it open. Fresh air and sunlight poured in, and I stepped outside, blinking in the brightness. The overgrown grounds of Ravenscroft Manor stretched out before me, peaceful in the morning light. Birds were singing, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the ancient trees. It was as if a great weight had been lifted from the entire property. I turned back to look at the house. It still loomed, imposing and a bit forbidding, but it no longer felt malevolent. Whatever dark presence had inhabited it was gone. As I stood there, trying to come to terms with everything that had happened, I heard the sound of a car approaching. A moment later, a sleek black sedan pulled up the driveway, crunching on the gravel. A man in a suit stepped out, his eyes widening slightly as he saw me. "Mr. Holloway," he called out. "I'm Martin Weaver, from Blackthorn, Weaver and Associates. We've been trying to reach you. When we couldn't get in touch, I decided to come check on you personally. I must have looked a sight, disheveled, exhausted, probably wild-eyed." But Mr. Weaver maintained his professional demeanor. "Is everything all right, sir?" he asked, concern creeping into his voice. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. How could I possibly explain what had happened? Who would believe me? "It's been an interesting few days," I finally managed. "There's a lot about this place I didn't know." Mr. Weaver nodded sympathetically. "Your uncle was a complicated man. I hope you found everything in order." I almost laughed at that. "Not exactly," I said, "but I think things are better now." The lawyer looked confused but didn't press the issue. "Well, sir, now that you've fulfilled the terms of the will by staying at the property, we can proceed with the rest of the inheritance process. Unless, of course, you'd prefer to keep the manor?" I looked back at Ravenscroft Manor. Despite everything that had happened, I felt a strange connection to the place now. It was part of my history, for better or worse. "I think I'll keep it," I heard myself saying. "It needs a lot of work, but I think it could be something special." Mr. Weaver nodded, pulling some papers from his briefcase. "Very well, sir. If you'll just sign these." As I signed the documents that officially made me the owner of Ravenscroft Manor, I felt a sense of purpose settling over me. The house had dark secrets, yes, but it also held the history of my family. Maybe, with time and effort, I could turn it into something positive. I knew there would be challenges ahead. The basement full of Uncle Edgar's experiments would need to be dealt with. The house itself needed extensive renovations. And who knew what other secrets might be lurking in its shadowy corners. But as I shook Mr. Weaver's hand and watched him drive away, I felt ready to face whatever came next. I had faced down a supernatural horror and lived to tell the tale. Surely I could handle a little home renovation. I turned back to the house, my house now, and took a deep breath. "Well," I said aloud, "let's see what you and I can accomplish together." As if in response, a warm breeze swept across the grounds, rustling the leaves and carrying with it the scent of new beginnings. I smiled and stepped back inside, ready to start the next chapter of the Holloway legacy at Ravenscroft Manor.